All right, now next thing we're going to do is talk about the magnetic lasso tool, and we're going to be taking this little nautilus shell and we're going to be putting it up here. So magnetic lasso tool is underneath the other lasso tools. So if you select a lasso of some sort, go down where it's got a little magnet on the, it looks like a polygon lasso tool with a magnet, and that's basically what it is. So it's sort of like a polygon lasso, but what happens is that instead of you clicking to drop the points, it does an edge finding. So let's blow this up a little bit. It does an edge finding of like difference of pixels, and it isolates the difference, and it will actually start dropping points for you. Now, one of the things that can happen whenever you're using the magnetic lasso tool is that if you start going kind of fast, it sometimes gets confused as to where it should drop the points, and so it starts to kind of mess up. If you find that that's happening, don't worry, don't try to go back and fix it right away. You can still make your selection, and then you can go back like I showed you before using the shift key to add, or the option key, alt key, to subtract from your selection if you grab too much or too little. Um, but anyway, let's just go ahead and give this a try. So if you want to go ahead and take a peek up here, what we can do is, let's blow this up a little bit more even. All right, and then I'm going to start my tool right here. Kind of doesn't matter exactly where you want to start it, but it's kind of up to you. So I'll start my tool here, and then you'll see as I go, it's dropping its own little points for me. I'm not doing this. It's finding the edges for me, and you can see how fast I'm going. If you start going too fast, it will start to stray. And so it's really up to you how fast you want to try it. And then I'm literally not clicking. One thing though that you can do is that as you're going around an edge of something and you start to see that it wants to drop a point in a weird place, you can prevent it from doing that and kind of change the course of its path by literally clicking to drop your own point. So if I wanted, I could click right there and I just dropped my own point, right? So sometimes that actually is quite helpful when you're using the magnetic lasso to be able to make it do what you want it to do as opposed to what it thinks it should be doing. All right, so, and you want to try not to stray too far in. Like if I were to drag this in too far, it would actually find a place to drop a point. And so you just have to be kind of careful not to go too far away from the edge. All right, and this is a really easy, convenient, this tool's not always this easy to use, to be honest, but because it's got a radically different set of values and patterns behind this Nautilus, which has mostly the same stuff, then it's not too bad. And you'll notice here it's saying with the little completed circle that shows up right there every time I move it, it wants to complete the path. So here, to complete the path, I do need to click it, and then it makes my selection for me, which is great. All right, so that's a really simple tool to use. Again, this is something where I would probably choose to feather it. It's your decision, especially when you have a curved edge. I think having like maybe a 1 pixel feather sometimes is a good idea, because otherwise you'll start to get this like really clipped and cut out look. I didn't add a feather ahead of time. This is my way of doing it. So this is where I would say, if this were an important file, oh, I would go ahead and I would save that selection, and I would go up here and call it Nautilus, or let's just call it shell, whatever. It's fine, but it's Nautilus shell. So I saved that. And you'll notice too, the other thing I didn't make a point of mentioning this, but some of the tools, when you try to make a selection when you're not on the actual layer where the item is, some of them will tell you that it can't make the selection because it's not selecting the pixels properly. If you wanted to, if you wanted on some of these, this particular option doesn't give it to you, where you're basically using all the layers, but sometimes you have to actually select the layer in order to make the proper selection. So I just want to throw that out there, especially if you're using an older version of Photoshop. It's not as smart on the older versions of Photoshop. So anyway, so now that I've saved that selection, I'll go ahead and I'll add my feather of 1 pixel. And I'm going to zoom back out a little bit so I can see where I'm about to drop it. And I'm going to copy it. And I made sure that layer 0, my main background layer is selected. I'm going to copy and I'm going to paste. And now I can take my move tool and I can move that right up into the spot that it needs to go. Okay? And so I think that that's probably not too bad. All right. Okay, so that's that last part. And then I think in the book, one of the other things that it wants you to do is it wants you to take this little screw and put it in these corners as decorative elements. So let's go ahead and we can go ahead and take care of that really quickly. All right, so let's zoom back in on this screw area. And this is kind of like a perfect circle. So I'm actually going to go ahead and use my elliptical marquee tool, and I'm going to show you this is the way I would do it, is to use the trick where you start in the circle, in the center of the circle, and click and hold down Option or Alt and draw, and then also hold Shift down. And what it does is Option Alt makes it draw from the center, and Shift will constrain it so that it's a perfect circle in both the X and Y axes. And you'll see here that it's still not perfect. You know, I can use that spacebar if I want to move it over, but that starts to get a little bit tricky, kind of like with all of my different key commands that I'm doing. If I let off that spacebar, you know, I can, maybe what I want to do is actually, you know, sort of make this a little bit smaller, just a tiny bit smaller than it actually is. And then I can always go back and scale it if I want. So I'm going to let up off my mouse, then I let up off of Option and Shift after, okay? And I could, you know, just choose to copy that, but if I want the whole screw and not just this interior part, then what I need to do, I'm going to sort of blow this up so I can see better what I'm doing, so that you can see better in the video. Anyway, so what I want to do is make this just a tiny bit bigger so that it starts to get some of this exterior a little bit. And that's one of the things sometimes that you have to do, is you have to let up off of it early. You could go back and redo your selection, but if it gets a little hairy like that, the other thing you can do is go back up here and say select, and you can go back to modify, and you can say expand. And we can expand that selection just a little bit, maybe by, let's try by like 4 pixels and see what that does. And that's not too bad, right? That's okay. And then if you don't like exactly where it's located, you can kind of use your nudge tools, which are the arrow keys, to kind of nudge it into the position that you want it to be. All right, and so that's not too bad. And then if you wanted also to kind of remove some of this part where the flathead is open, and maybe remove some of this part, I don't think the book shows you to do that. It just tells you to take this, and it's kind of your decision. But what I would probably want to do is, maybe this is where I want to use my regular lasso tool, and I'm going to hold down Option. On Windows it would be Alt, and I'm going to kind of remove a little bit from that selection like that, sort of, you know, kind of just a little bit from the selection like that, kind of. And then if I wanted to be really persnickety, I could just also remember that I'm blown up right now to 517%. If I were to go back down to 100%, you know, that doesn't look too bad. And then at this point, what I could do is I'm going to go ahead and add a feather to that. You could, or you could choose to do it or not. Or I could also save my selection in advance. Let's do that. Let's save it selection. I'll call it screw unfeathered. All right. And then at this point, if I want to go ahead and feather it, I can modify, and then I can add my 1 pixel feather. Okay, and then at this point, what I would probably want to do is copy it while I have my background layer selected, copy it, and I want to paste it. And so now what I have is I have this whole new layer. I can call this layer screw. I'll call it screws. Oops, let's try that again. Screws, okay. And then I can move the screw to any of these corners if I want, all right? And that looks a little bit big, and so I can zoom in a little. Let's zoom in here, and I want to make that smaller. So at this point, I can do my free transform tool, which is Command or Control T, while I've got my screws layer selected. And then if I click and drag this this corner, if I hold down Option, it'll, and also Shift. So I'm going to click, then hold Option, then Shift. Option will make it scale from the center, and Shift will keep the proportions constrained. So I might want to keep a screw that's like maybe like that. Then I let up off of my mouse and then off of Option and Shift, and then I can hit Enter to commit to it. And that's probably not too bad. So let's see if that size is okay. And then, you can make a decision if that's small enough for you. If it's not, you can make it a tiny bit smaller. It's really kind of up to you. And then what I could do is I could either duplicate the screws layer, or the other thing that I could do is I could make this a really crude selection at this point, because if I were to turn all my layers off, you see, or my background layer, you see that this screws layer right now has no pixels around it, so I don't have to be that careful about the selection that I make, because I'm not going to pick up any of this background layers. I'm not going to pick up any pixels from it because I have my screws layer selected. So if I come up here and I take my lasso tool, and I can just make a crude selection around it, you can see that, like, if I turn off that background, it doesn't have any of those pixels from the layer 0 or the background layer selected. What I can do is I can make that selection, and then I can take my move tool, and while I have the screws layer selected, this is where I can see how I get the scissors. I don't want to cut it, but I want to hold down Option, and then I get a duplication, and then I can just move this and make a copy of it and sort of put it in that corner. And then while it's still selected, I can do the same thing again, where I've hold down Option, and you see the double-headed arrow, and then I move it over here, right? And then I go and I do Option again, and I move it over here. So you can totally do that if you want. And then if you really wanted to make these look like they weren't so identical, the other thing that you could do as well is if I do my Command T for my free transform tool, I can kind of rotate it. I'll hold down Shift so that it rotates it, like on an angle. So then that way each one looks a little different. I can commit to that. And then if I wanted to come back up here while screws is selected, I'll take my, let's take my lasso tool again. And then I can select this guy, and I can use my free transform, and I can turn this one. Let's get that curved, right? I'm going to hold down Shift, and I can kind of turn that one a little bit like that, right? And then I can come over here with my lasso tool, and then if I hold down free transform, so Command T or Control T, I can turn this guy just a little bit too. So they're all just a little bit different, right? And they don't look all exactly the same. Deselect, and now that's all happening on my screws layer. So if I turn the screws layer off, you can see that all 4 of those disappear, right? And so this is kind of, I mean, it's a little bit different than the book shows you. I mean, in terms of like me putting things in layers and how I'm saving selections and stuff like that. But I think that it's really valuable for you to start to think about this in advance. I mean, this isn't exactly a full-on layers exercise or lesson, but layers are such an integral part of Photoshop that I think that introducing them early enough on is actually very helpful to you. And so the last thing the book is going to tell you to do is that you can go in and you can crop this. So a thing I haven't done recently is I haven't saved. So before I even do that, I'm going to go up here and I'm going to just save my working PSD, okay? And then if you wanted something else that you could do is you could save this as another copy. If you wanted to keep this intact for later, you could also go in, and of course the book doesn't tell you to do this either because it didn't even use layers. I'm going to go and I'm going to say File, Save As, and then I'm going to save it as working, and then I'll call it cropped. So that way, whenever I crop it, it's not going to get rid of all my stuff down here. So I can come over here and you can use my crop tool, and you see right now what it's trying to do is it remembers, because I didn't actually reset all of my tools, it's remembering the last thing that I did, which was width and height plus times resolution. So it's 7 inches by 7 inches, 200 pixels per inch, and that's not what I want. I actually want a ratio, or specifically I could change it to, you know, something different like an 8 by 10 kind of thing, or, you know, you can change the orientation. All right, so and flip that orientation. The other thing that you can do, and this is what I personally like to do, if I, you know, truth be told, I'm going to hit escape and I'm going to get out of this crop tool. This is what I like to do for cropping, and this is totally your decision if you want to mess with this. But if you go over here to the rectangular marquee, you can actually go, and we're going to come over here and do a marquee, and you can see it. I think you can see it more clearly. Again, this is, you know, entirely up to you how you want to do this. And I can draw my marquee tool like that, and I can make a decision if that's how I want to crop it or not. And then if I like the way that looks, maybe I think that there's a little bit too much on the top, so I can hold down my Option key and I can pull a little bit out of that selection like that. Actually, let's pull it even closer in like this, and we'll pull these edges out too. So we're removing some from it. All right, and so I think I like the way that this is going to look cropped, and then I can go up here to image and I can say cropped. And what I like about that is that I don't have to specifically use the preset tools, the preset options in the crop tool. I don't, you know, anyway. And I can just make the crop based off the selection that way. So it's kind of nice. So that's really your decision how you want to do that. Those are some different ways of dealing with it. All right, so now I've got that, I can deselect it, and this is my final image, okay? And the last thing I would want to show you really quickly is, like, if we go up here to look at, well, first of all, if you look down here, because of, you know, the way that you've got this, I have document dimension set up, and it says now the document dimension would be like a 5 by 3, so, you know, it'd be 5 inches wide by 3 tall at 300 ppi. So that's something that you could print at 5 inches wide by 3 inches on a piece of paper, and it would look really nice at 300 ppi. Anyway, so if you wanted, the other thing that I was going to suggest is, since this would be something for print at 300 ppi, you could go up and you could export this. You could up in File, and you could say Export, and you could say Export as some different things. Now, if you were to export something like Export as or Export as a PNG, I just want you to understand, and the book doesn't talk about this, but I want you to understand that these are basically for screen presentation formats, like web presentation or like a PowerPoint or something that's going to be displayed only on an electronic monitor. It's not going to be printed on a piece of paper or in a poster or something like that. What this is going to do is it's going to change the resolution automatically from 300 ppi to 72 ppi, and it'll let you set the dimensions, but in terms of width and height and pixels. But I just want to make sure that you understand that this export, it might be good in some other Adobe programs that you may or may not have used for exporting things for print, but this is not. This export right here is specifically right here, these two top options are for web. So is this one where it says save for web. So what you would want to do is you'd want to go to save as, if you want to save a flattened version. First of all, make sure that you've saved it. So let's just go ahead and let's say save, so that you know that all your changes have been saved. So you can go here and you can say save as, and then we're gonna, basically it's gonna save it as a copy. You can click on as a copy, and we're going to get rid of layers, and we're going to get rid of alpha channels, and we're going to save like a flattened version. And if it was for print, you would want to probably save it as a TIFF file. And so we could save a flattened version that was a TIFF file, and we can call this something like final seascape or something like that, whatever you wanted to call it. And again, the book doesn't go into this, but this would be like the final thing that you would actually print. You wouldn't want to necessarily send that gigantic PSD file to your printer because it's going to be a lot of data. This will be a smaller file. It would be perfectly good resolution for print. All right, anyway, and so you probably don't want to compress your image, and you can just leave all these the same and then click OK. And then if you were to go back into your Finder or your Windows Explorer, you would see that you have that new TIFF file there. In fact, we can do that real quick. Okay, so I just pulled up my Finder, and you see right here we've got this final seascape image. And there it is. If I take a quick peek at it, that's what it looks like. And it's flat. I don't have to deal with any kind of layers or anything like that. And one of the things that you can take a peek at, let's just drag this in real quick. Oop, having a hard time with that. And then you'll see that the size is so much smaller. Like if you were to send this thing called working cropped, for instance, to your printer, it's almost 10 megabytes. The final seascape is less than half of that, or it's less than half of that. And so this would be exactly the thing that you would want to send to a printer, because it's a smaller file size, especially if you had, for instance, a lot of different images inside of, like if it was for a magazine or a poster layout, and you had a lot of other images in there, you would want to make sure that you gave them the most sort of compressed version that also preserves the quality that you want as possible. Okay, all right, so that's going to do it for this demonstration on selections.